The report we're publishing today is the result of months of hard work by all of my colleagues at IDMC. So I would like to take a moment to express a warm thank you and heartfelt congratulations to all of you. I would also like to thank our various partners in different countries, including governments, United Nations agencies, and non-governmental organizations who peer-reviewed and provided expert advice on our report. Their contribution was invaluable to enhance our report's quality and policy relevance. The production of our report would also not be possible without the generous support of IDMC's funding partners, so we would like to extend our thanks to them. In a few minutes, I will be joined on stage by our keynote speaker, Jan Egeland, Secretary General of our mother organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council. Since he started in this role in August 2013, Jan has been overseeing our colleagues' life-saving work in 40 countries around the world, providing assistance to millions of displaced people in some of the world's most acute crises. He will be followed by my colleague Vicente Anzellini, Global and Regional Analysis Manager and Coordinator of the GRID, who will present the report's key findings. We will then hear reflections from a panel of distinguished speakers, moderated by my colleague Dawn Voet, Head of External Relations. But before I give the floor to my colleagues, let me say a few words about the report and why we are here today. Once again, this year's GRID is a stark reminder of the challenges the world is facing. There have never been so many people living in internal displacement as there was at the end of 2023. That's roughly twice as many as there was a decade ago. Many exceptional displacement crises occurred last year. Sudan now hosts the largest number of internally displaced people ever recorded for a single country. Over 80% of Gaza's population has been internally displaced in less than 3 months. In many countries, conflicts and disasters overlapped to create alarming conditions for displaced families. In Syria, for instance, many people previously displaced by conflict had to face displacement again as a result of the earthquakes that occurred in February. Disasters also led to record figures, for instance in Canada, where the hottest summer in 76 years fueled the country's most destructive wildfire season on record, triggering unprecedented numbers of displacements. Once again, new and protracted conflicts, as well as sudden and slow onset disasters across the world, forced millions more people to flee their homes in 2023. We mustn't forget that behind those unfathomable numbers are children, women, and men, each with their own individual stories, their own needs, and their own aspirations, who are now struggling to rebuild their lives. It's also important to remember that although internal displacement affects every country and region in the world, its impacts are felt at different scales and intensities. One common thread across all countries is that it invariably hits the poorest and most vulnerable people the hardest. It leaves them in situations of prolonged displacement that can have far-reaching consequences on themselves, on their children, their communities, their societies, and even economies. The main raison d'être for IDMC and for this report is to shine a light on internally displaced people and the challenges they face, so that policymakers, operational actors will increase their efforts to prevent future displacement and to put an end to existing situations. There has been much welcome attention to internal displacement in the past 5 years, since 57 member states representing every geographical group, and including states directly affected by internal displacement, wrote to the United Nations Secretary General calling for the establishment of the high-level panel on internal displacement. the Special Advisor on Solutions to Internal Displacement, who is here with us today, has been driving the implementation of the Secretary General's Action Agenda on Internal Displacement for the past 2 years. We are again at a critical juncture with his mandate ending at the end of this year. IDMC very much hopes that the world will maintain this political momentum, and we will continue to provide the necessary data and evidence to that end. With this, I would like to now give the floor to Secretary General Jan Egeland for the keynote address. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you very much, Christelle. Friends, it's a big day for us. This report is really the flagship report of our very own Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and as Christelle said, many long hours have been spent on getting all of the figures correct and finding out how is it going really in this world of ours. Because to me, it's one of the starkest indicators of how international relations are going, how international diplomacy is faring, how global, regional, and national governance is faring, how we are able to protect people, civilians, and how international humanitarian law is respected. It's all summed up in how many families have to leave their home because they're not protected, they're not safe. And if we're not able to keep mothers and fathers with their children and their grandmothers and fathers safe in their homes, we're really failing. So how is it going? It's not going well, really. It's not going well at all. Neither in protecting people against the climate-fueled natural disasters. But I would say this report 2024, which is an X-ray of how the world was at the end of 2023. More than anything, it shows that conflict and violence is rampant around the world. 66 of the world's 190 or so countries today have internally displaced citizens from violence, conflict, persecution. 66. 45 of those saw violence-caused displacement in 2023. 45 countries, really. 43 of those, nearly all of them, had on top of the war, the conflict, the persecution, also natural disaster displacement. So this perfect storm, really, of all of the elements and all of the plagues in the Bible coming to haunt very vulnerable people at the same time. And we were not there to protect them and defend them in their hour of greatest need. That's the story here. This indicator need, of course, to lead to action. And let me say a few words on that at the end. But again, looking at the report, and I really encourage you to read through and see all of the great graphs, statistics, illustrations, and snapshots of both violence and disaster-caused displacement. What stands out, perhaps more than anything else, is that 5 countries have 50% of all violence-caused displacement in the world. 4 of them are protracted conflicts and emergencies. Syria, Democratic Republic of Congo, Colombia, Yemen. It's been there now for many years, and in each and every of these cases, it hasn't gotten better of late because the conflict got old. It got worse. And then comes Sudan on top of that. As Christelle said, 9.1 million people at the end of last year being displaced because of violence in their own country. We haven't recorded that since the Second World War, really. Maybe the breakup of India was worse in 1947. This was, of course, a preventable conflict. 2 generals create havoc in the civilian population. Why wasn't it prevented, and why was there so much fuel for the fire? I think these are the questions to be discussed and to be answered. Because if it continues like now, we'll reach unheard numbers of people displaced. There is also the question of repeated displacement. And I know Ambassador of Ukraine is here, and again, people are being displaced next to Kharkiv. We just discussed it because of violence against civilians, of indiscriminate bombardment. The perhaps most graphic case of repeated displacement in populations that are not protected at all is Gaza. So 80% of the population was displaced since the horrors that were committed in Israel by Hamas and other horrific militants. Since then, 80% of the population has been displaced. 80%. But it's not once. My colleagues from the NRC are fleeing now out of Rafah, some for the 5th time, some for the 6th time, one family for the 8th time since mid-October. And this repeated displacement happens in all of the conflicts we document here, and it again shows that there is not mechanisms for the displacement that is for the violence. There is not protection of civilians as there should be. So, what needs to be done? Let me end with that. Of course, in terms of natural disasters, it's really climate justice. Those who flee are predominantly in places that did nothing to cause climate change. Nothing. And those are also the people that are most prone to lose everything and get nothing back, no return either, to their places of origins. So for the natural disaster displacement, that is climate fuel, is really climate justice. There have to be mitigation, and there has to be repair, and there has to be compensation, and there has to be on a global scale, because there is one global warming. On the conflict side, I think that 3 elements that we discuss in the report are very clear. I mean, the conflict prevention is fundamentally failing. There is one assault after the other on peaceful people, and the violent men, their political and military leaders, do that with impunity, really. The conflict prevention isn't working. Secondly, the protection of civilians during conflict is really not working either. Well, we all talk about protection. NRC is an organization that prides itself being really seized with the matter, but we also need to admit that in place after place we fail to prevent the violent men from burning villages and bombarding civilians. We have to be better finding better ways, as we are in some places. There are also many good examples of protection of civilians before they are displaced. We need to be able to bridge the gap between more and more displaced people have less and less food per capita as we speak. I was in Lebanon, where the internally displaced and the refugees, Syrians and Palestinians, are having reduced food rations, less cash assistance, less education, and less health provision in a place like Lebanon, where there is new displacement because of the exchange of missiles between Hezbollah and Israel. And it's a representative case all over the world. And finally, the durable solutions. I think Robert Piper here present will talk about it. And there are some very good examples of durable solutions happening. But it has happened too few places because we accumulate the number of people in need of durable solutions and not getting it, whereas there is more and more people who have to flee into despair in search of a durable solution, which is developmental, political, and diplomatic. There is no humanitarian durable solutions. It's political, it's diplomatic, and it's developmental. I think we have a task cut out for us, Christelle, and I thank you all for coming to the launch of this important report.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you again for joining us as we launch what is now the 9th edition of our global report on internal displacement. Let me dive straight to the main findings. And the main finding is really that internal displacement broke new records in 2023. We reached an all-time high of 75.9 million internally displaced people globally. This is up from the 71.1 million in 2022, and as you can see, the highest ever recorded. You see here the trend of the last 10 years. We thought, and we have been constantly reporting an ever-growing record. And this is, of course, as Jan flagged, highly concerning. So new waves of conflict in Sudan, in Palestine, but also persisting conflict in the DRC contributed to pushing this figure. Floods, storms, and last year particularly earthquakes also played a role in this ever-increasing trend. If we break down the figure by type of trigger, we can see that 68.3 million were displaced by conflict and violence. As Jan also said, across 66 countries and territories. And for those who are familiar with the grid, you may be familiar with this map. But this year we added this new visual element that actually shows the the share of the top 5 countries against the global total. Sudan, Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Colombia, and Yemen make up almost 50% of this total. And it's really important to remind that all these situations are situations of protracted internal displacement. And we also reported new conflict displacement last year. The global figure also has a lot of nuances in the national level trends. Some countries, such as Colombia, Iraq, and Libya, as you can see here, have managed to somehow lower the trend. But in others, such as Syria, it has remained stable and even with a slight increase. but Sudan saw a sharp increase last year. So it's really important to also analyze these nuances, but also to take into consideration that the instability, insecurity, infrastructure damage, and institutional disruption that conflicts cause can leave people displaced for years. In terms of disasters, the first thing that probably will jump to the eye is the lower figure compared to conflict and violence. And this figure is actually the reflection of a major data gap that we're trying to visualize every year in our global report, is that basically, although we have a very good understanding of how many displacements took place during the year, it is still very challenging to fully understand for how long people are displaced following disasters. Why? Because basically the reporting stops soon after the crisis phase of a disaster recedes, and then we're left with a gap. And we're trying to fill this gap, so this figure is very likely to be the tip of the iceberg. But the second thing that will probably jump to the eye is the wider geographical footprint that the phenomenon has. High-income countries, including Canada, the United States, Germany, and Japan, also had people that were still displaced as of the end of last year. So disaster displacement can take place at any time in any place of the globe. Here, again, you have the top 5 countries and their share against that global total. Afghanistan remained again the country topping that list, and as you know, it's also home to millions of people also fleeing conflict. Pakistan, these 1.2 million, many of them, more than 1 million, were still displaced by the 2022 floods. So again, many of these situations are also protracted. But even if in this report we treat conflict and disasters as distinct triggers, it is really important to remind that they often overlap, multiplying the vulnerabilities. And this is precisely what Jan was flagging, is that out of the 45 countries where new conflict displacement was reported last year, 43 of them also reported disaster displacement. And as you can see, if we look back in time, the reality also confirms this overlap. But beyond the figures, it's really important to remind the implications that it has for people. This girl who is smiling despite the circumstances lives in the Shashabo camp in northwest Syria. The governorates of Aleppo and Idlib are home to 52% of all conflict IDPs in Syria. This is one of the most protracted internal displacement situations globally. And without exception, every year we record displacements by floods, harsh winter conditions, snowstorms. And last year, it was the earthquakes with epicenters in neighboring Turkey that triggered the highest disaster displacement event on record in the country, affecting this particular 2 governorates. So it's just one case of many, sadly, of these overlapping realities. What I presented so far is the snapshot or the total number of people still living in displacement as of the end of the year. But in IDMC, we also think important to, or try to capture the dynamic nature of the phenomenon. And that is why what I'm about to present does not correspond to people, but correspond to movements of populations during the year. Why? Because people can move more than once in the course of a year, and these figures are brought down to 0 every year. And what you see here is the number of displacements by conflict and violence, and you can clearly see that in the last couple of years, there has been a significant increase. The peak of 2022 can be explained by the conflict in Ukraine, where the moving front lines actually triggered significant multiple movements. The figure for last year was slightly lower, but still the second highest in the last decade. And it's really important to point out that together, Sudan, the DRC, and Palestine made up 2/3 of this figure. In terms of disasters, there's much more fluctuation. It very much depends on rainy season, typhoon and cyclone and hurricane seasons. Last year, the figures were not the highest. The highest were in 2022. And the lowering trend can be mostly explained by the transition from La Niña conditions to El Niño that basically led to drier conditions in Asia and Pacific. That is the region where most displacements by disasters tend to be recorded every year. That said, although there were drying conditions in Asia, there were wetter conditions in the Horn of Africa, and some countries, including Kenya and Somalia, reported their highest figures ever. So again, it's really important to nuance a bit this global aggregate and look at it more in detail, which of course we do in the report. Also, and what I'm gonna give here is really a snapshot of for each region, but I highly encourage you to read. We break down the report by 6 regional overviews. And let me start by Sub-Saharan Africa because it's the region most affected globally, with 34.8 million people living in displacement as the year concluded. To put this figure in perspective, is 46% of the global total. So put differently, nearly half of all internally displaced people globally are in Sub-Saharan Africa. And as you can see in the chart above, the trend is on the rise. Another key finding of this region that you can see in the chart below is that conflict and violence also reached new heights. 45% of these 13.5 million movements were reported in Sudan alone, followed by the DRC. And also in terms of disasters, it was the second highest in the decade with 6 million movements. As I said, many very much influenced by the floods in the Horn of Africa, but also by Cyclone Freddy that hit several Southern African countries and territories. I would like to zoom into Sudan because, as was said already, is the country that had the highest figures that we have ever reported, 9.1 million. And here you see the relationship between the two metrics of movements and total number of IDPs. There were already 3.6 million people living in displacement in Sudan in 2022. And as the conflict erupted in April 2023, which is you see in the bar charts, there were a lot of movements as the front lines shifted. There was another spike in December, and all of these contributed to pushing this figure to an all-time high for the country, but for the region and globally. And beyond the numbers here again, it's really important to underscore the impacts that this had on the population, including rising food insecurity, especially malnutrition among children who also lost education. So we may be talking about longer-term implications for the futures of millions of people. In the Middle East and North Africa, if we look at the chart above, you can see that the number of people living in displacement was on the millions already. And although there was a lowering trend of new displacement by conflict, which is what you see in the chart below, solutions were not met for many, and that's why the chart above remained pretty flat. But then there was a clear shift last year as the conflict in Palestine erupted. 3.4 out of the 4.1 million displacements by conflict were reported in Palestine alone. And this, of course, influenced the increasing trend. And another key finding here is that disaster displacement was also the highest ever reported. And it's important to point out here that there are many gaps in terms of disaster displacement in this region, so we should consider this figure also an underestimate. And around half of that figure was only reported precisely in Syria that I mentioned before. Another zooming into the Palestine situation, what you can see in the chart on the right is, and on the dashed line, is the total or estimated total population of the Gaza Strip, and what you see piling up is the total number of internally displaced people since the 7th of October. The main finding here is that 83% of the Strip's population was internally displaced at the end of the year, 1.7 million people. And as Jan said, many of them fleeing but then twice, and again, right now as we speak, right? And overcrowding in shelters emerged as a pressing issue, with some facilities really exceeding their intended capacity more than fourfold. Another very concerning challenge was the fact that people were asked to evacuate to areas that got bombed, and this also contributed to the high death toll of this conflict. I'm going to go rather quick through Asia Pacific and South Asia, where the trend is basically the same in terms of disaster, but the main finding here is between East Asia and Pacific, which is this slide, and South Asia, which is the next one. These two regions basically tend to push the disaster displacement figures, the global figures, higher. But last year, as you can see, the figure was lower because basically there were drier conditions. But that doesn't mean, however, that we're talking about millions of movements due to storms and major floods as well. And many of these storms, including Cyclone Mocha, also affected Rohingya refugees, but also Rohingya IDPs on the Myanmar side of the border, in Bangladesh, and then on the Myanmar side of the border, overlapping again and creating more vulnerabilities. And in terms of conflict and violence, the trend has also increased, and you see the sharp increase from 2022 to 2023 in the chart above, in the number of IDPs. That sharp increase is mostly explained by the situation in Myanmar, where we see a rising conflict-related displacement since the 2021 military takeover. South Asia is also home to a significant number of internally displaced people with 8.2 million, mostly in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And as I showed before, in the case of Afghanistan, we're really talking about people displaced by both disasters and conflict. And a clear, very talking example of this was what happened in the province of Herat in the west of the country last year, that was already home to the largest internally displaced population by conflict, and then was hit again by the earthquakes in October that represented the second highest disaster-related displacement event in the country. So we're really, and it's important also to flag for Afghanistan that no new conflict displacement was reported. However, that doesn't mean that the needs of the more than 4.5 million IDPs by conflict were met. Actually, the humanitarian needs increased in the country, and the overlap of disasters and conflict contributed to this. In the Americas, the trends were more or less similar to last year, but as Christelle flagged in her first intervention, one of the main events was really the Canada wildfires. Normally, it's the United States where most wildfire displacement is reported, and last year it was Canada. You probably remember the news. Back in the day, a lot of evacuations, mostly because these wildfires actually approached urban areas and forced people to flee to save their lives, basically. And in terms of conflict and violence, the figure was slightly higher. 85% of this figure that you see in the third bullet point, 637,000, was in Colombia and Haiti alone. In Colombia, there was a slight decrease in the trend, but still the highest in the region. But the situation in Haiti was very concerning, especially because it's a situation of criminal violence, and is the country where most displacements by criminal violence were reported globally. And this is the last region, which is Europe and Central Asia, that was home to 7.2 million people living in displacement. And this is not a small figure. It's 10% of the global total. And out of the 7.2 million people, 3.7 million were living in Ukraine alone. And this figure should be considered an underestimate because data was not available in the territories occupied by Russia. Another thing that, so you clearly see basically the spike that we've seen in both charts in the last couple of years. In 2022, as I said before, in terms of new conflict displacements, we even had to kind of cut the bar to make it fit in the graphic. And that happened again last year for disasters. Out of these 4.3 million displacements by disasters, 4.1 were reported in Turkey alone. And in terms of conflict and violence, the figure was lower than the previous year, mostly because the front lines of the conflict in Ukraine got more static, but still 779,000 displacements that were recorded across the region. 99% of them were associated with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Now, this is my last slide, and I wanted to conclude this presentation by highlighting that although the report presents the alarmingly high numbers of displacement, reminding us once more about the urgent need to take action to reduce this ever-growing trend. It also highlights where initiatives to support solutions have made a difference in reducing the scale and severity of the phenomenon across countries. From the Philippines to New Zealand and from Ethiopia to Colombia, the report also highlights how governments, their international humanitarian and development partners, civil society groups, and internally displaced people themselves have put in place measures that lead to durable solutions. While the path is long and requires sustained political will and investments, it is possible. And there are examples of good practice that can be extrapolated and adapted. As every year in IDMC, we think that data and evidence plays a key role in galvanizing action for durable solutions. And before I close down, I just wanted to let you know that beyond this report that you have in your hands and that you, of course, also find online, we have country profiles and country-level information available in our website, but also I would like to invite you to navigate our global internal displacement database that has, where you can basically run your own query and extract the data. And do not hesitate to contact us in case you have questions or need further analysis. So thank you again, and hand over to the panel. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dawn Marie Voot. I'm the Head of External Relations at IDMC, and I will be moderating today's discussion. I'm joined by a highly distinguished group of speakers who each in their own capacity have been supporting some of the most complex internal displacement crises across the world, who I will introduce you to in just a few minutes. But before that, I wanted to take a few minutes to please lay out some of the context and what our expectations at IDMC are that we hope to achieve out of this discussion itself. So far, you've heard from NRC Secretary General Jan Egeland, who's pointed to the real gravity of the situation worldwide right now. You've also heard from my colleagues, Christelle Cazabat, as well as Vicente Anzellini, who's provided you the overall findings of this year's global report on internal displacement. Beyond the scale, we're seeing increasing levels of severity and complexity. As Vicente pointed out, we see often overlapping triggers of disaster and conflict displacement. In addition to that, we're also realizing that food insecurity as well as climate change impacts is continually exacerbating needs of the people and continuing to push more and more people into displacement year after year. And unfortunately, what was once the exception, repeated, cyclical, and protracted displacement has now, unfortunately, become the global norm. We also know that with each displacement crisis comes its own set of unique challenges. But we also know that we can learn from the past and apply good practices and efforts to identify solutions for IDPs trapped in cycles of displacement. You've all seen the news this week, this month, this year. You know that the situation for the world's IDPs is particularly bad right now. And as Christelle mentioned, at the same time, global awareness and political commitment to this issue has never been higher. And I like to think when I look at the level of expertise sitting on this panel with me today, that this is really testament to that fact. In addition, when I look out at the room, at all of you, as well as I see the numbers of people that have joined online, I'm reassured because I see really a pool full of internal displacement experts, operational actors, policymakers, donors, academia, researchers, basically committed, concerned citizens who all are ready to collectively pool our resources, and in doing so, we can turn the tide on internal displacement. So my hopes, really, for this discussion are that we can learn from the examples that our panel will provide, both of the challenges they faced and how they've gone about addressing those challenges, but also of some of the good practices they've personally been able to employ, and try to apply that to our own work in ways that we're able to one day, hopefully, reconvene as we launch our next global report, be it next year or the year after that, in slightly less bleak circumstances. So on that note, I'm really pleased to introduce you to our panel of experts. We have joining us 2 in person, as you see, and hopefully 2 online, which I thought we would be seeing by now. But let me start with the introductions to Mr. Robert Piper, who I think most of you probably know, is the Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Solutions to Internal Displacement. Mr. Piper also has been coordinating the implementation of the Secretary General's Action Agenda on Internal Displacement. He's specifically focused on strengthening UN leadership on solutions to displacement through increased member state engagement, building stronger linkages to the development system, including through international finance institutions, and by driving collaboration across the UN system. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Her Excellency, Ambassador Yevgenia Filipenko from the Ukraine, who has served as the permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations office in Geneva since June 2021. She has been engaging with Geneva-based humanitarian organizations to ensure support for relief efforts in Ukraine in response to one of the largest forced displacement crises across the world. Prior to this, she was the head of the Directorate of International Organizations at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, where she worked with the UN country team in Ukraine and drove solutions to displacement her country has been facing since the start of the conflict in 2014. I'd like to also introduce those online, but I don't know if we are having... here we go. Great. Welcome. Our next guest is Mr. Bruno Lemarquis, who is the resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator, as well as the deputy special representative in the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Since January 2022, a position he has also held in Haiti. He has been coordinating the UN humanitarian response to the internal displacement situation in the DRC, but also bringing together humanitarian and development partners to enable solutions early on. Welcome, Bruno. And last, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, who is the chairperson of the Department of Political Science from the University of Dhaka and founding chair of the Refugee and Migratory Movements Research Unit. She led the drafting of Bangladesh's National Strategy for Internal Displacement Management in 2021 and its National Action Plan in 2022. She's published extensively on climate change and disaster-related human mobility, adaptation, internal and international labor migration, and remittances. She's also a member of IDMC's advisory group. Before we go to the questions, just a few points. We will have a few questions to the panelists that I'll be asking in the beginning. Those of you joining online are welcome to pose your questions in the chat or the Q&A function throughout the discussion. We have colleagues working behind the scene that will be responding to some of those questions, but also sending them to me on my phone. So I apologize in advance for looking at my phone from time to time. I'm really just trying to find the questions that are coming from the online participants. In the meantime, we will also be having about 20 minutes at the end of this discussion for those of you in the room to pose your questions to the panelists. I'd like to start with you, Robert, if that's okay. Sure. For the past 2 years, you've been driving the implementation of the SG's Action Agenda on internal displacement, specifically focused on solutions. As we heard from Jan and others, today's displacement crises will likely become tomorrow's protractedness. What are some of the key lessons we can do to reverse this trend towards protractedness?
Thank you, Dawn, and let me just take this opportunity too to congratulate IDMC and the team for producing this phenomenal report. It really is a key reference for this issue, and to Jan Egeland for his leadership over so many years to keep the fires burning. Jan, thank you so much. As always, this incredibly compelling engagement on this. Thank you. I think the question of how do we reverse this growing phenomenon of protracted displacement, I think I would offer three key kind of lessons that we've seen on that. The first is, it turns out, and this won't be a surprise to some of you, solutions begin from the very start. So the choices that are made at the beginning of a response to a displacement situation are going to fundamentally shape when and how a solution comes along. And I don't think, realize that with the clarity that we have now, that the choices you make at the very start about whether or not to open camps or to integrate people into communities, whether or not you set up data systems that can be shared with government as soon as possible, if not from day one, so that this is a common sort of set of reference numbers. Whether or not you invest in livelihoods and education and documentation, these types of investments are the investments that get people much quicker towards a solution than other alternatives that are often, unfortunately, much easier to fundraise for. And the biggest variable of all, the extent to which government is able to be integrated into the response early on. Ukraine, I'm sure we will hear from day one, was leading the charge. In other countries, we don't necessarily have that option. But of course, ultimately, solutions need to be government-led, and the opportunity cost of not getting government in the driving seat as early as possible is enormous in terms of getting to a solution and to breaking this cycle of protracted displacement. It's complicated, but it's something we have to wrestle with. Second key variable, I would say, is leadership. Not the obvious motherhood statements about government ownership. We know that. Of course, governments need to own this solutions problem. These are their citizens, after all. But what we're seeing in the last few years is the game changer is political leadership from governments, not just sort of technical ownership of the problem, because displacement solutions are very sensitive, are very political. It's about land and property. It could be about electoral rights being restored. It's of course around conflict and social cohesion. These are very, very sensitive issues. Compensation, transitional justice. Bureaucrats can't fix these issues. We can't even make a decision on issues like standards for housing. These are very sensitive questions. When you look in a sea of fairly poor people and with fairly poor housing, where do you set that benchmark for housing quality? Because you've got to defend it to the rest of the citizens. It's very political. So that's the second piece, which is we need government ownership and we need political leadership from governments if we're going to break this protracted displacement. And lastly, key variable is, of course, financing. It's a question of volume, but it's also very much a question of the quality of financing. We wrestle to pin down how much we're spending on internally displaced people through our humanitarian efforts every year, but it's somewhere in the vicinity of $5 to $6 billion a year in maintenance to support IDPs in their displacement. We need a fraction of that to try and get people onto a solutions pathway, but it's got to come from the development side of the house. We don't need humanitarian money of a short-term nature to build more transitional structures. We need to build houses, not shelters, and that's expensive. $5,000 a unit in Nigeria, $25,000 a unit in Iraq. Start multiplying that by 100,000 households, 200,000 households, and as they say, you're starting to talk about real money. It's not going to come from a humanitarian budget, and it's not the kind of money it's not the sort of resources that are short-term resources. So the third message, I guess, in terms of breaking this displacement is, of course, accessing the right kind of development financing or government financing. Iraq will fund its solutions pathway. Libya will fund its solutions pathway. Colombia will pick up a big share of theirs. Others will need more assistance from their partners from outside. But we have to close this loop between this massive spending on the emergency side of the equation, of the ledger, in terms of responding and maintaining people in their displacement, versus unlocking the investment money from the development side of the equation in order to start bringing those numbers down. That means aid agencies, donor agencies, need to also close that circle in their systems. And it isn't easy at all for them to do, but that's the breakthrough. I think we need also to break this protracted displacement pattern.
Great.
Thanks, Dawn.
Thanks so much, Robert. Really interesting, the 3 lessons in terms of solutions beginning from the start, leadership, the political leadership you mentioned, and also financing. I think that's a really nice segue, actually, to the next question. And I'll turn to Ambassador Filipenko on that. Ukraine was already facing a protracted internal displacement situation before Russia's invasion in 2022 pushed millions to flee both internally and across borders. Last year, we recorded 714,000 conflict displacements, a decline from the 16.9 million recorded in 2022. The emergency remains, however, for the 3.7 million people living in displacement, but protractedness is a real risk. How has the displacement situation evolved over the past 2 years?
Thank you very much. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you for this opportunity to share Ukraine's painful experience with IDPs. But before I start, I would like to say sincere gratitude to the IDMC for your leadership in producing yet another sobering report. And over the years, the IDMC's global reports have established themselves as the world's leading and reliable source of data and analysis on IDPs, and they serve as a reference point for national governments, including my government, for informing our planning and policy response. We meet at a time of significant upheaval, an age of chaos, as was recently said by UN Secretary General. I cannot but echo concerns about the numbers of IDPs. This 67 million people living in internal displacement worldwide, and armed conflicts continue to be the major source of displacement. Across the world, violent conflicts continue to be more complex and protracted, leading to prolonged displacement and humanitarian needs. Internal displacement in Ukraine is a case in point. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2024 caused the fastest growing and largest displacement crisis in Europe since Second World War, with a staggering 19.5 million Ukrainians affected by various forms of displacement. It came on top of 8 years of Russian aggression against Ukraine, which started in 2014 with the attempted annexation of Crimea and war in Donbass. During the first wave of displacement in 2014-20 and until 2021, up to 1.8 million Ukrainians were forced to flee from their homes, and these people constitute 13% of the present IDP population in Ukraine. Full-scale invasion brought about the second wave of displacement. 1/3 of Ukraine's population has been forcibly displaced by war, both within Ukraine and abroad. The number of IDPs reached a record high in April 2022, when about 18% of the general population were internally displaced, which was equivalent to 7.7 million individuals. Since then, the number of IDPs has been gradually dropping, with the latest figures from Ukrainian government indicating there are about 4.8 million officially registered IDPs in Ukraine. This decrease has been largely driven by returns to the areas in the east and south of the country, which were liberated by Ukraine in 2022. Some 4.6 million people have returned to their place of habitual residence, despite safety and security concerns posed by relentless bombardments, shelling, landmine contamination. However, it should be noted that such returns are not always sustainable, as nearly a third of the estimated returnee population reside in locations which experience severe destruction or total disruption of livelihood services and vital social services. About 60% of all displaced people reported having been displaced for 1 year or longer. Unfortunately, prolonged displacement leads to protracted needs, depleting IDPs' resources and capacity to cope with loss of job or income. There is a clear economic burden of displacement in my country. According to the UN, more than 3 million IDPs are still in need of humanitarian assistance, facing challenges around livelihoods, rental support, and protection. Women, children, people with disabilities, and elderly constitute overwhelming majority of IDPs. As I said, due to the government's response, which was acknowledged by Mr. Piper, the IDP numbers have recently stabilized. However, future projection remains bleak as the war continues unabated. Extremely dangerous is the situation in the Kharkiv region, which was mentioned by Mr. Egeland, where over the weekend Russia launched military offensive threatening the city of Kharkiv, which is home to nearly 1.3 million people, including a large number of internally displaced people. Russia's assault is putting at risk a densely populated Donetsk region of Ukraine. If continued, the offensive on populous regions with the highest internal displacement in the country, this could have disastrous impact on millions of people and provoking further massive displacement. To avoid this nightmare scenario, Ukraine has been consistently urging the international community to put pressure on Russia to stop unprovoked and unjustified aggression, to stop suffering of innocent people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think overall it's obviously a really challenging situation right now, and I really appreciate that you shared all of those comments with us in this group. I know we're out of time, so I'm just going to move now quickly from one situation that's highly complex, be it Ukraine, with active conflict, to the next, and call upon our speaker, Bruno Lemarquis, who's joining us online in the context of the DRC. Bruno, the DRC has long been one of the largest situations of internal displacement globally. It has also been one of the most neglected crises for the past few years, according to NRC's annual report. Indeed, lack of visibility has been one of the key issues that Robert and IDMC have been working hard to address. Can you please explain the magnitude and complexity of the displacement situation in the DRC?
Greetings. Can you confirm you hear me well?
We do.
Okay, very good. So greetings from Kinshasa. Greeting everybody. Thank you, IDMC, for all your work and your support. Thank you for the opportunity to shed some light on the Congolese crisis, which, as you know, is one of the world's most complex, protracted, because it has been going on for 30 years, overlooked, but also I call it one of the most tolerated crises on Earth. The humanitarian need has significantly increased over the past year in the context of resurgence of conflicts, unspeakable violations against women and children, as well as epidemics and flood. And it's more urgent than ever to find solution, first and foremost, political solution. This is happening at the time when MONUSCO the UN peacekeeping operation is withdrawing from the country after 25 years of presence, at the request of the government of the DRC, and we just ended the mandate in South Kivu, for those who are familiar. So while this is going on, the country's security landscape is deteriorating, with very high level of tension in the region, especially between the DRC and Rwanda, and the risk of a regional conflagration in the Great Lake region. And this is mainly due to the what we call the M23 crisis. The M23 is an armed group, and the activism of other armed groups, especially the ADF, which is a foreign armed group affiliated with ISIS, as well as the emergence of other pockets of stability. So all this has worsened over the past year. And this widespread violence has many consequences, direct in terms of massive population displacement, and many indirect consequences, including on the country's development pathway. For example, this has prompted the government to spend much more on defense, and the DRC had in 2023 the world's highest increase in military spending. They had to double their expenditures on defense. So all this has fueled an extremely dire humanitarian situation. In spite of its incredible potential, the DRC is home to the highest number of food insecure people in the world. And in terms of displacement, we've recently passed the 7 million mark, 7.2 million people displaced, mostly in Eastern DRC. And in percentage, this is a percentage of the population displaced in Eastern DRC. 40% of the population of Ituri is displaced, over 30% of the province of North Kivu, and 22% of the population of South Kivu. So that's very high numbers. Since the beginning of the year, daily fighting in North Kivu, as well as increased intercommunal violence and atrocities perpetrated by armed groups, have forced close to 800,000 additional people to flee their home, especially around the town of Goma, which is the capital of North Kivu at the border with Rwanda. Goma being basically surrounded by the M23. And those people are living in appalling conditions. At the same time, the situation is characterized by massive violation of international humanitarian law, atrocities, attacks against civilian infrastructure, presence of many armed men in IDP sites, and so on and so forth. The gender-based violence is, the norm is that it is high, but in this context, it is very, very high, and this prompted the IASC last year to declare a system-wide scale-up in the DRC. All of that is also compounded by a risk of epidemics. There are always many risks of epidemics in the DRC, and especially this year, cholera. We have a very high number of cholera cases. We often talk about the conflict of the DRC, but it's also one of the countries in the world most affected, most vulnerable to the effect of climate change, and the frequency of climatic hazard and the intensity is also increasing. Because of insufficient effort on disaster risk, often those climatic shocks turn into large-scale disasters. At the end of last year, we had 2 million people affected by flood, with the Congo River at its highest level in over 60 years. And currently, floods are generating chaos in Eastern DRC, with the overflowing of Lake Tanganyika, which is affecting several countries of the region. In this situation, humanitarian actors are totally overstretched because of the high level of needs, but also the many challenges they face in terms of access, security, and also funding, because the DRC, because the needs are so high, we need so much money. But the DRC is regularly underfunded, and this year, like many other countries, we are very underfunded. But this crisis is not unfolding in a vacuum. It has been going on for 30 years. There is a complex political landscape in the region and a complex security landscape. On the ground, the situation is very complex. I won't give you all the detail of the forces that are at play, but basically, on the one hand, you have the M23 that is supported, including in-country, by the Rwandan defense forces with sophisticated weaponry. And on the other hand, you have the Congolese army, you have private security contractors, you have Uganda and Burundi having a bilateral agreement with the DRC government. You have a regional force from the Southern African Development Community, and you have the force of the peacekeeping force of MONUSCO. So all that in mostly in North Kivu. So it's very complex, it's full of risk, and sometimes it needs deconfliction between the different forces. The regional political processes, there are two regional political processes. Both of them are more or less stalled. One is about disarmament of armed group, and the other one is rebuilding trust between DRC and Rwanda. So those processes really need to be reinvigorated. And finally, in terms of the origin of this large-scale displacement crisis, it's not possible to talk about it without talking about the roots, the underlying driver of the conflict, which I call the Gordian knot. I don't know if it means something in your different languages, but the Gordian knot, the intractable roots. First and foremost, the exploitation of natural resources. You have tin, you have tungsten, you have coltan, you have gold, and many of those goals are exploited illegally and smuggled to neighboring countries and find their way into our electronics, your iPhone, my iPhone. All those equipment have blood minerals from the DRC, so that's the route number one. Which is the solution is global. It involves many actors, and the other route is the illicit financial flows with all the money that is leaving the country illegally. So that's in a few words the landscape in the DRC and the magnitude of the displacement crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bruno the Marquis. I think that was a really comprehensive overview, and unfortunately for the more than 7 million IDPs living in the DRC, we're really given the example of here an overlapping crisis situation. He spoke about climate change impacts, food insecurity, the displacement itself, the conflict and violence, cholera outbreak, the flooding, and on and on, unfortunately, which I guess helps to explain the fact that this situation has not only been a protracted situation, but it has very acute needs up until today. I think overall what's going on, at least in my mind, and I think in a lot of other people's minds, is how to ensure that protection needs are continually met in contexts such as this, which we see that there are acute needs and there's ongoing conflict and violence. But I'd like to first turn now to more of a disaster angle as we invite Ms. Tasneem Siddiqui to the discussion. Hello, Tasneem.
Hello.
Tasneem, my question to you, I'll read it. It's a bit long. I apologize for that in advance. But while there has recently been a surge in conflict displacement, which we've heard quite a bit about now, we also know that disasters cause more displacements every year and can leave a significant number of people living in displacement in situations of protracted displacement. Bangladesh experiences annual large-scale disaster displacement, the majority through government-led preemptive evacuations. We spoke about the importance of government ownership and leadership, but more inclusive national ownership through a whole-of-society approach is also essential. From your experience as a civil society actor advising the government of Bangladesh, how instrumental have non-governmental actors been in driving the action on internal displacement in Bangladesh?
Thank you very much for inviting me to such an important event, IDMC. I do, yes, it is right that, it is IDMC data that for quite a while attracting the attention, global attention on the issue of disaster-induced internal displacement, and also particularly the Groundswell Report 2021, which said that due to slow onset processes, by 2050, 260 million people will be displaced if right kind of steps are not taken. In that scenario, if you look into the Bangladesh situation, a large number of people are being displaced. Just think of Cyclone Amphan. 2.5 million were temporarily displaced, and then drought and other things are, contribute to displacement. However, these data in the context of Bangladesh, we have very little data on this respect. So government actually, it is, quite compassionate about the issue of displacement due to river erosion, due to, different other events. But, the whole of society approach, if you think, is very much there when it comes to DRR, But when it comes to disaster-induced displacement, that is yet to emerge. Why I'm saying that, it is true that government is open to civil society participation. However, and it has provided space to organization like Refugee and Migration Research Unit to be the, in the board which prepared the national strategy on internal displacement. However, that strategy, when the issue of implementation comes into, the resource allocation, other ministries' knowledge about the national strategy, and then again providing all civil society bodies to participate, those type of resource and space is yet to emerge. And in that respect, I would say a few specialized civil society organizations are concerned about this displacement issue, but mainstream organizations, mainstream NGOs, civil society bodies in Bangladesh are yet to take over this issue of displacement. So again, in this whole situation, if you put that now government has a national strategy, government has an action plan to, 20-year action plan to take steps to reduce displacement. And that action plan covers all 3 stages, prevention, protection during displacement, as well as durable solution. However, when you take this whole thing to development partners, you do see a kind of that this is a disaster they want to deal as a humanitarian issue, but integrating disaster and climate-induced displacement along with the adaptation strategies together and coming up with a human rights-based approach in handling disaster-induced displacement is yet to emerge. So whole of society approach also requires other organizations, civil society bodies, to their capacity, build up their capacity. I think those things are still in the incipient state in Bangladesh. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tasneem. I think this was really enlightening as well, and interesting to hear that though there's a strategy, the issue of displacement itself and human mobility has not fully come forward. In addition, looking at the fact that yes, there's the strategy, but we still have questions about resource allocation, how it can be adequately resourced, and then the fact that we really can't look at this issue as just a humanitarian issue anymore, that we really need to bring in the development partners. And that links in, of course, to an extent with the funding and the financing needed for that. So thank you, Tasneem. I'd like now to turn to the speakers and ask one more set of questions and focus a little bit more on insights into what you see as key enablers and promising practices that can advance prevention and durable solutions to internal displacement. So I'm going to first turn to Bruno online. And I'd like to ask if you could coming back to the response to the overwhelming situation that you described, in your capacity, you're well placed to try and address some of the challenges related to coordination, for example, between humanitarian actors, but also between humanitarian and the development community, including the government. Can you describe some of the challenges you've tried to address on some of these issues, please? Specifically focusing on data collection, planning, financing, if possible.
Thank you. So first to say, in light of what I described earlier, we really need a robust and efficient humanitarian response in the DRC, given the high level of needs. But of course, this is not the solution to the DRC's problem. So in terms of solution, I see 3 levels. First is the primacy of politics and political solution for the people of the DRC first, peace for the people of the DRC, but also because the DRC, with its unique forest, which is the #1 forest to sequestrate carbon in the world, and its critical mineral, is a country that needs to be in peace because it's a country that has a special role to play as a solution country for some of the world's problems linked to climate change and energy transition. So the world needs a DRC at least. The second one, it's imperative to work more, to work much more, many actors, member state, private sector, and so on those issue of the root causes, especially this issue of exploitation of natural resources and illicit financial flows. It's about transparency, it's about traceability, it's about governance, and it's about justice. The third is the operationalization in terms of solution, the operationalization of the HDP nexus and how to advance with durable solution, conversation and action in the DRC, where there are many opportunities. There are pockets of the country that are in active conflict, but there are also, it's so big that you have all scenarios. So we have, there are many post-conflict regions. You have a region that are stable, that are at peace. So and many regions where you have chronic level of vulnerabilities because of lack of development. So in such complexity, coordination is very essential and it's very complicated. First, coordination among humanitarian actors. Our main challenge relates to the size of the country, to the number of actors involved, and also to the need for a greater engagement with the authorities. So we have a complex coordination architecture, provincial, national. We have operational and strategic, but I think it's more complex than elsewhere because of the giant size of the country. The coordination between the humanitarian and development actors and the national structures, national institutions is also very complex. It's a challenge. Too often there are disconnects. And that sometimes lead to blame game. We blame each other. So it's really important to work on strengthening those interfaces between the partners and the national authorities. To have so we are working on, like all my predecessors have been working on that, but to have a functioning political and strategic interface with government, and also to have joined-up coordination mechanisms so that we don't have parallel systems. But overall, like Robert has said, it's really key to identify the political leadership, those people who want to move forward, and to also foster national ownership. When it comes to the coordination around the nexus, this is a lot has been done in the Congo around the nexus since 2019, but I think we've reached certain level, and now we need to move at the next level. There are a number of challenges we are facing, and we are working with all of them. First, it's to have consensus and what do we call the nexus, and sometimes it's really striking the differences of opinion between people or partners. It's really striking. The second one is how to have political leadership, national ownership, government at the center, and not only in the conversation but in the action. The third is how to move at scale in terms of, for example, durable solution, moving away from a project here and there, but really to move at scale to have a real impact on humanitarian needs. The fourth is for us to move this approach to some of the conflict-affected provinces and to work on pockets of opportunities. And the last challenge is to expand the group of partners involved, especially the IFIs and the private sector. So we are working on all of that, and it's an uphill challenge. Now, a few words on data, since the panel is also, the report is a lot about data. So given the scale of the humanitarian needs and the limited resources, we really need to do everything we can to ensure that the people with the highest needs are properly prioritized in the distribution of humanitarian assistance. So hence the need for good data on the severity of need to be able to prioritize properly. At the same time, it's important to have good data, reliable data, to make the case to keep the DRC crisis on the radar of international attention. If we are not careful, if our data are not trusted, it erodes the trust with our partners and donors. In the DRC, this issue of data is not an easy task because of the complexity, the multiplicity of crises, the very dynamic environment, the alerts. There are many alert systems in the DRC, the huge territory with limited physical access, the insufficient data collection, the lack of capacity on the government side on data. There has not been a national census over 40 years. And the time it also takes for the National Population Commission, the National Commission for Population Movement, to validate the figures. So we have a lot of challenges when it comes to data. Despite the constraint, we are working hard to improve, and we have some good practices. For example, since last year, every month now we issue a data page with the most validated data on a range of issues, so that everybody use the same data and we don't contradict each other. We are still facing challenges in terms of discrepancies of IDP figures. And this is because there are different approaches, methodologies, systems among various organizations. So we are working with OCHA, IOM, HCR, with IDMC support. Thank you for that, to go over those issues, but they have been there for quite a long time, and it's a bit of a frustration not to be able to resolve them. And finally, because of lack of time, just to say in terms of funding, it's very key when we move to solution, as Robert has said, to broaden our partnership. So we are in active conversation with the IFI, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the IMF on issues of fragility, resilience, durable solution, and also with the private sector. In addition, of course, to being very active in the discussion on how to help the DRC efforts to mobilize additional domestic resources and also to tap into innovative financing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno, for the comprehensive overview again. I'll just make a few follow-up points and then move on because I know we're running out of time. But on data, I agree, and I'm glad to see that IDMC has also been involved. It's, of course, one of the main findings that came out of the independent review on humanitarian response to internal displacement on data specifically, that we need better harmonized data, more interoperable data. So we're very keen to continue supporting that in the DRC context specifically. Then you also mentioned quite a bit on coordination. It's quite encouraging to see that you've built these mechanisms, which hopefully then can be repeated and moved into the more conflict-affected areas of the country. As well, you spoke about the nexus, which of course is quite keen. And then I'll just maybe end on the political commitments and leadership as we move to the next question, which will then come back to Ambassador Filipenko. Because Ukraine has shown quite a bit of leadership when it comes to supporting the needs of IDPs throughout the last decade even. I'd just like to ask, prior to Russia's invasion, your government of 2022, your government was already providing assistance to and planning for medium-term solutions for hundreds of thousands of IDPs for many years through an impressive legislative and policy architecture. In the grid, we note that durable solutions remain a distant prospect for many IDPs. How can your government already start planning for solutions in the current challenging circumstances?
Finally, first, let me emphasize the critical importance of reliable data and analysis for ensuring response to displacement needs, to anticipating future displacement risks, and for developing durable solutions. In Ukraine, all displacement data is collected and managed through the centralized database of IDPs, which has been operational since 2016 and was updated in 2022 to face new displacement challenges. This mechanism proved useful in ensuring that displaced persons are integrated into national and local development policies, budgeting, and programs. In 2023, a displacement dashboard was launched by Ministry of Social Policy of Ukraine that helped better understand the evolving needs and inform targeted response. Ukraine is one of the most digitalized countries in our region, and we have a very advanced e-governance system, which offer the IDPs new accessible services and opportunities. For instance, all eligible displaced persons can apply for IDP status, state social benefits, or restoration of damaged housing through the government-owned mobile application called DIA, without any queues, paperwork, or waste of time. And digitalization of these public services, social services, has enabled the government to identify and assess the needs of IDPs, get help more quickly, and streamline social benefits. As you rightly mentioned, in 2022, Ukraine has already had rather robust legislative and policy frameworks, which allowed us to cushion the initial shocks of displacement crisis. Since then, consistent effort has been made to amend the law on IDPs, rights and freedoms of 2014 and strategic policy document to further align them with the guiding principles of international displacement and international human rights standards. We are doing our best to address internal displacement as whole of the government and whole of society priority. We have made important progress supporting solutions of and integration of IDPs, including through promoting their access to livelihood, social services, health, education, and adequate housing. Let me note that only about 110,000 IDPs are currently accommodated in collective sites, while the remainder of more than 4 million IDPs are staying with host families or in private housing with rental support from the government. And since 2022, more than 3.7 million IDPs benefited from government-led program called Shelter, which provided rent subsidies to host families. In the past 2 years, the government disbursed more than $3.1 billion in social benefits and rental support to about 5 million IDPs. Here, let me thank Mr. Jan Egeland, who has unfortunately left, and the Norwegian Refugee Council, which are also at the forefront, complementing with other partners Ukraine's efforts, including through cash assistance programming. Human rights-based approach and social economic integration are promoted through the network of local IDP councils that draw together local authorities, IDPs, and civil society. However, with the prolonged displacement and depleting resources and coping capacity of IDPs, more than ever there is a clear need to focus on durable solutions. It's absolutely essential if we are to prevent their further displacement abroad and sustainably resolve displacement crisis. Major development in this direction was the adoption in 2023 of the State Policy Strategy on Internal Displacement, which aims to support IDPs at all stages of displacement, including through durable solutions. Efforts are ongoing to strengthen resilience and self-reliance of IDPs, rebuild their livelihoods as part of broader work to facilitate medium and long-term socio-economic recovery, reconstruction of social, residential, and critical infrastructure. Importantly, humanitarian development nexus and recovery measure have been factored in response and programming of our humanitarian partners, including IOM and UNHCR. And I would also like to recall that next month in Berlin there will be Ukraine Recovery Conference, which will focus, one of the sessions at this dimension of this conference will be on social recovery and human capital for the future of Ukraine, which will specifically address, including the probably contribute to durable solutions to IDP problems. There are encouraging examples of partnerships involving international organizations, regional investment banks, and private partners, which foster innovative approaches and affordable housing. So these are also about durable solutions. And here I would like to commend the UN Secretary General Special Advisor on Solutions to Internal Displacement, Robert Piper, and your team. We thank you for taking forward the Secretary General's action agenda on internal displacement, and we look forward to studying the achievements and best practices in implementation across the world, and which would be helpful to inform the decision taken in Ukraine. Let me be clear that despite all our efforts, resolving internal displacement crisis and avoiding a repeat of the massive exodus ultimately rests on finding sustainable solution to its root cause, which is Russian aggression. Otherwise, durable solutions will all remain a distant prospect for many IDPs in Ukraine, as rightfully stressed in the grid. On 15 and 16 June, in this country, in Switzerland, there will be the first peace summit on Ukraine. It will offer a unique opportunity to develop a framework for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in Ukraine. So we expect that the leaders of the countries from around the world will come to Switzerland with the commitment to the principles that guide our peaceful coexistence and will help to develop the framework for peace in Ukraine, which would also be the best durable solution for internal displacement in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Filipenko, for once again sharing those comments. I think overall, you demonstrated a number of really salient points. Earlier, you had mentioned the returns and, of course, the importance of the international community and others to be able to provide support to ensure that those returns are sustainable should be of utmost importance. But in addition here, you demonstrated the importance of having national legislation and a policy to guide efforts and demonstrate the government's support to IDPs overall, which I think shows great leadership on the government of Ukraine's part. You also mentioned how you're aligning much of that strategy with the guiding principles on internal displacement as well as human rights standards, which is, of course, really fantastic. But overall, when you mentioned the IDP councils and other civil society actors getting involved to really support these needs, it really demonstrates beyond government that this is really looking at a whole of society approach. So thank you very much for that. Moving on, I know we're still running a little bit short on time, but I think the discussion warrants that. I hope that everybody is quite interested in hearing Tasmin Siddiqui online again to look more from the disaster angle again. And Bangladesh has been a model in preventing internal displacement. What have been the key lessons coming from Bangladesh in terms of policy making and operational planning and on prevention specifically? To what extent has the national strategy on displacement managed to tie together prevention and solutions?
If we want to learn from Bangladesh, I would say first thing will be, how to, come up with evidence-based research to convince policymakers
internally displaced persons in itself. It's a horrible acronym, and it's very hard to engage on a BBC interview. Jan does it better than most on with this term of internally displaced persons. And when everyone talks about forcibly displaced people, which kind of makes it's a bit easier to get your head around, it almost invariably means refugees for most people. So those 76 million IDPs are almost invisible when it comes to kind of communication around forcibly displaced people. So I do think we need some new language around IDPs. I spent my first few months thinking about whether I could throw myself into that, and I failed. But I do think it's dehumanizing. I'm not sure what the obsession piece of it. I would say yes, I am obsessed with the internal displacement, but I think it needs a few obsessed people to make sure the issue is not lost. But I do kind of sign up to this issue of dehumanizing, and I also find that we treat displaced people in blocks rather than as individual households. And I think that speaks a bit to Mark's point about participation and agency as well. It's a little horrific, I find, when I compare the way in which UNHCR and its partners really look at refugee households and try and figure out solutions for individual households. And in some countries like Mexico, even go to the trouble of sitting down and doing a life plan exercise. It's unimaginable to have that kind of quality attention to households that have been internally displaced. Unimaginable. Maybe it happens in Ukraine, but it will be absolutely the exception to the rule. I find that very troubling that we aren't able to do it. It's not to say, I mean, I hold that refugee model up as a gold standard that we should aspire to, rather than kind of it somehow being wrong. I think it's exactly what should happen. And I wish we could treat IDPs with the same level of kind of respect and individuality that they deserve. When you think about what they've experienced and the extent to which their social contract with the state has been destroyed, it really is, they deserve much better. I think this question of the words of encouragement, I mean, DTM is obviously the backbone of a lot of this data, and I don't think we get enough opportunity to acknowledge that, and to the donors, of course, IOM, but the donors too to IOM that make the DTM possible. It's hundreds of thousands of people, I think, involved in producing this data in the background, which is really, really staggering. So I think we really need to get that message to the collectors in the field about how crucial their role is and how much we depend on it, and how important this granular information is. No two IDP households are the same, and the longer it takes in displacement, the more complicated the picture becomes for the household, with different generations with different aspirations for what should happen next. So huge thank you to the collectors, and really incredibly important. Yes, and I think Mark made this point about participation. We do talk a lot about it. We don't act on it sufficiently. And we have pushed, so we have this model that we are promoting on solutions, which has 5 core components. And the most important of it is indeed IDP participation at a national level, in terms of being part of the dialogue on the nature of the problem, to a role in developing the strategy, so that IDPs actually are the ones that will measure success, not us on their behalf. They've got to be the ones, in a sense, that judge whether we've succeeded or failed, to involving them in the actual implementation, of course, of our work. We have to get better at that. We're collecting, Rekka's in the room, and she leads in our team on this. We're collecting best practices, and they do exist. Ukraine is a fantastic example. Bangladesh is another, but we need to now make that really a kind of reflex across our system. And I think Mark's essentially right. We have a very long way to go.
Great, thanks. We're running really close to the end, but I did want to take a question from online and try to engage also the online speakers. So we had a question to Tasneem. What are some long-term implications of displacement on children in Bangladesh, and what can be done to mitigate them? You're muted. I don't know if it's from her end or here.
Now, I think it's a very important question. The children, if you think, what I would say that, you know, the impact of displacement and coping mechanism, everything depends on age, sex, gender, all these issues. I can just mention one of our research where children came up that what do they, you know, how do they suffer? They suffer for water logging when they go to school. They suffer for lack of places in urban slums for playing. They, you know, so their concerns are not reported in mainstream concerns, because when livelihood, food security, and other things become more important, then children issue, it's, I wouldn't say underplayed, but then they don't get the focus. So in case of displacement, now it has to be any program, anything has to take into the voice of children, elderly, everyone, not only working age men and women. So that's my thing on the uh, say on the children. And of course, I would just like to say, now we talk about climate, those who moved in the context of climate change. We don't say climate induced migration, because migration takes place because of many reasons, not only one reason. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just 2 more minutes left. Bruno, I don't know if you wanted to come in with any final remarks on your end, because you're the one that hasn't gotten the opportunity to speak in response to any of these questions.
No, well, just to follow on what Robert said on participation, I think it's very, very important to have bigger ears and smaller mouths, and to listen to people, not only IDP but all affected people. And when so Robert has answered from the solution side, but for those in the room who work on more on the humanitarian side of displacement, I think it's really important to do better in the listening. Often that's my experience in the DRC. You have the conversation with the IDPs under the tent, where basically they will read a statement that speak to the organization of the humanitarian clusters, and then you speak to them outside of the tent, and then you have a different story. They will talk a lot about livelihood. They will talk a lot about vocational training for their youth, because they don't want their youth to join the armed group. They will talk about things that bring back dignity. And because the humanitarian system is very much supply driven, we don't always give them what they want. So I think it's very, very important that this discussion advance in the humanitarian system. I like very much what Martin Griffith has been trying to do through his flagship initiative. For those who are familiar, it's basically to give a little freedom to humanitarian coordinators and people on the ground to shake things. And at the center is the voice of the people, and then you adapt your system, you adapt your approaches, you adapt your tools, so that they respond to the real need of the people instead of being supply driven. So I think this issue of participation is really key. Thank you. And just final word to say big thank you to IDMC for all your work.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. In closing, I just want to then, I know we could talk forever actually, but we do have some drinks, and we'd be welcome to, of course, inviting anybody to have side discussions as well. I first want to thank all of our panelists for sharing their experiences overall, including the challenges, but also some of the good practices, which I think we can all apply to our own work into advancing progress on internal displacement. We touched upon a number of key priorities that they mentioned that I think we really need to take into consideration. First and foremost, the importance of IDP inclusion and ensuring the voice of IDPs. This has been like the thing that I feel like has come out almost the strongest in this discussion. But in addition to that, national ownership and government leadership, of course, was really important. The importance of effective coordination and harmonization overall, ensuring the rights of IDPs are continually respected, and also basing policies and action on concrete data and evidence. Before I let you go, though, I did want to bring our attention one last time back to the global report, because that is ultimately why we're here, with one final example, hopefully as a bit of an incentive for you all to read the reports that are in your hands. The example comes from the Philippines. In 2017, approximately 350,000 people were displaced by urban conflict in the city of Marawi. Since then, the government has applied several of the principles that we've discussed today to try to help find solutions for its IDPs, including, for example, investing early and mobilizing a response team that looked at the comprehensive needs of IDPs overall. In addition, ensuring that IDPs were involved in deciding and informing the solutions to what they needed. And then improving and harmonizing data collection were three of the key main things. I like this overall example because I think it demonstrates the commitment of government, civil society, and of the IDPs themselves. And as we've said already a few times now, that it's not just about a matter of having a whole of government approach, but looking at the scale of internal displacement worldwide, we really need to be adopting a whole of society approach. On that note, I thank you all for participating today, and we look forward to building upon the partnerships that we've already established at IDMC, and of course would welcome you all to join us for a cocktail or a light drink in our reception just following this in the lobby just outside. Thank you.
Thank you.